one of the most interesting things about working on this project, bringing Joseph Plumb Martin to life, so to speak, is bringing a story about a little-known revolutionary to the forefront. A lot of historians know about Joseph Plumb Martin, but for the general public, he might not be a name that's familiar. So bringing his story to the forefront as a young individual who experienced revolution firsthand, using his own words in a play to bring his story to life. It's been an interesting challenge to make sure that this play this performance is engaging for the visitor and interesting to listen to and a learning experience.
Something you said, Matt, is really interesting, which is that we use a lot of Martin's own words from his memoir, which is still available. But I was curious, Patrick, what was it like having to parse out Martin's words and the words that stitch them together?
Actually, the piece is constructed so well that sometimes the challenge is remembering which words are Martin's and which are not. So that sometimes I have to actually go back to the script and look at the bold words. And I know that's something that's important for us is to recognize that this isn't just something that was created based on somebody's life where we don't have a lot of evidence. We wanted to pull the words directly from his narrative and incorporate them in.
Yeah, I think a lot about the process of making this. We worked with Dr. Philip Mead, who's the chief historian, head of curatorial affairs here at the Museum of the American Revolution, and a really talented educator and actor named Ryan Schwartz, and even Phil, who has spent years with Martin's writings, sometimes had a difficult time puzzling out, was that something I read in his memoir, or was that something that was transposed into it, which is cool.
Yeah, and I like what you said, Matt, about a little known figure, because I had no idea who he was before I started working here. And it was really interesting for me while working on this to be able to actually read his narrative and find out that he was pretty hilarious. He says some pretty funny stuff, and he has a real poetic side, which he talks about how he doesn't necessarily have he doesn't learn the rules of punctuation or things like that, but he writes this book so well, and it is such a great resource for diving into the life of someone like that.
Exactly, and Joseph Plumb Martin is a man who writes a memoir later in life, thinking and reflecting back upon his experience, and so kind of rewinding a little bit to bring him back to the moment when he's just finishing with the war itself was an interesting moment to choose, because it was a different moment than what Joseph Plumb Martin would experience in the 1830s, when he himself, as an elderly veteran, is struggling to get money for his family through government pensions, and what must have been going through his mind at that point in the 1830s compared to what was going on in his mind in 1783. Was an interesting challenge. So what choices do you make was he reflecting about some of his friends that he had spent years with? Was he reflecting upon one of the great victories for the American revolutionaries at Yorktown? What was he thinking about in 1783? Did he just want to go home?
Mm-hmm. I love that. I mean, it makes me think about how when many people think about the Revolutionary War, they kind of picture maybe people kind of like World War II veterans are today. They're old men. They probably wore powdered wigs back then. But we meet Martin as if we're meeting a veteran of Iraq or Afghanistan, right? He's a young man who's experienced 7 years of war, and now his next challenge is reintegration, right? Rejoining a whole new country, not just the country you left, but something that has been created in his absence, maybe in ways.
And he talks about in the narrative. He does talk about the battles, but he spends most of his time talking about the things outside of actual battles. Some of it is what you hear about, and I don't have military service myself, but you hear about some of the mundane aspects of being at war, where a lot of it is the hurry up and wait. And he spends a lot of his narrative, I would say he spends more talking about turnips than the actual battles, because he's always looking for something to eat.
And that's why his memoir is so valuable as a historical source, because so many sources leave out those aspects or only focus on high points and low points. But what about just the average, everyday experiences? And that's what Joseph Plumb Martin's memoir gives us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you get it here, Patrick, as someone who leads tours and talks to people. Often people's questions aren't necessarily about who won which battle, but it's like, what did they brush their teeth with? And like, did they wear their shoes when they slept at night? And Martin is one of the few sources that gets anywhere close to that level of kind of fine-grained detail.
Yeah, that happens all the time, especially for younger guests. They might be interested in how a musket works, but lots of times they're interested in why would you use something like this? Or why did they tar and feather somebody? There's a lot of those aspects of things that are outside of war and battle.
And those questions sort of bridge the 250-year gap between us and a person like Joseph Plumb Martin. Things like what did they eat on a daily basis? What did soldiers? How did they bathe? Those kinds of things. Those connect to our lives today, but also have connections to their lives 250 years ago.
Well, I'm really interested about what Martin doesn't tell us too. So if Joseph Plumb Martin was here on this panel, what would you ask him if you could ask one question?
I would ask him a lot about his life after the war, and what did he like to talk about with his children or his other family members? What was he most proud of, and what was he ashamed of? I want to hear those sorts of things from him, and we get a little bit of that in his memoir. But I'd like to kind of dig a little deeper into him as a person, as an individual, and his likes and dislikes. And learn more about that.
I think for me, it might be knowing what he knows. Like, say, I mean, if we bring Joseph Plumb Martin, say we transport him to the future, what Joseph Plumb Martin are we bringing? I would be interested, I think, in speaking to maybe the 68-year-old and asking, if you had to do it again, would you still join up? Knowing what you know and what you went through, would you do it again? Because he obviously, even if he did it, there's a lot of evidence, of course, in the narrative that he did it for that patriotism, for that adventure. It was nice to have the prospect of getting a little money,
right,
but he didn't get any of that. So would he do it again?
That moment of his friend, pushing his arm to have the pen scratch the paper. I would like to hear more about that moment too, going off of what Patrick was saying. What was going through his mind at that very moment?
I wonder too, what did he leave out? Is this something that did he think deeply about what scenes to include, or is this something that these were the moments that maybe all he remembered? Like, did he write down everything he remembered because these were the highest and low points, and after, his book includes one sentence about his life after the war. Like, it jumps 50 years and you're like, and then I went north. But like, what did he decide to leave out? And I wonder a lot, like, why is he the only one, right? His memoir is so exceptional and so unusual. Why do all the other Continental soldiers, why didn't they write down these things? We have amazing pension accounts. Sometimes they went to the courthouse and they recorded their rationale and their histories when they kind of had to secure a pension, but they didn't, as a hobby, write a memoir. What was he, like, if we could meet him right now, would he have seemed unusual and that's why he wrote an unusual book, or was he the one who lived long enough and got to record his thoughts?
I think that brings up an interesting aspect of Martin's story. And how did he write this? Did he keep a diary? That's something we don't know. He may have. Did he write notes down? There's a number of surviving Continental soldier books that document daily life, such as Tuesday we did this, the 13th of September we did this. But did Joseph Plumb Martin have something like that he held on to, that helped him remember and recall moments that may have been forgotten if he didn't have something like a daily journal or diary?
He was known as a storyteller in the town that he lived in, right? He was
As an old man.
Even as an old man, like he was a storyteller, he was a character. And it could be very similar to what happens today when you have people who are really good at telling stories. Some people literally just say, you should write all this down. You should write a book. And maybe for him it stuck. Maybe maybe I'm grasping at straws a little bit here. There, people like you two would have to do maybe a little bit more research. But was he so good at writing this down because he had been relating these stories for 40 years before he finally decided to write it down? Because it sounds like he liked to talk about it.
And he's writing as the revolutionary generation is dwindling. So is he trying to do a preservation effort, engage in a preservation effort to preserve that memory that he had been talking about for decades? But now was the time to write it down, because people like him that had lived through 1776 and experienced the revolution firsthand were no longer as plentiful as they had been before.
Kind of like when older family members get approached by the younger ones with a tape recorder. And they're like, tell us all your story.
Yeah,
We're trying to get it all in.
That's right.
I think a lot of people who think about the Revolutionary War assume that everyone back then was formal and humorless and they marched through life with pre-written eloquent sentences. But what we see in Joseph Plum Martin's wartime experience is that Continental soldiers were teenagers. And we also get a real sense of comedy and his sense of humor, but also, how complicated and what a complex emotional life people had 250 years ago. My favorite story about Joseph Plum Martin is how right after he arrives at Valley Forge late in 1777, he's so hungry he gets half a pumpkin and he cooks it on a hot rock. He heats up a rock in the fire and he's cooking this half of a pumpkin, and then he says, I didn't really wait until it was cooked, it was barely heated through. And I just have this image of both Martin in 1777 eating a raw pumpkin, and then Martin 50 years later being Valley Forge, people talk a lot about bloody footprints in the snow and how cold it was and how many people died, but what I remember is eating a raw pumpkin, right? So I wonder if there are stories for you guys or anecdotes like that show us the complexity of this person.
Yeah, actually for me, it's another part of Valley Forge when he's been there for a little while, especially because his stories can sometimes not contradict, but we have this idea, we take Valley Forge, we have this idea of everyone hungry, starving, cold. Joseph Plum Martin had a different experience. He was on the foraging parties. So he went out and was gathering the food. And when you gather the food, you have first access to the food. So he actually talks about how he never ate better during the war than when he was at Valley Forge on the foraging parties. And he actually did so well that at one point he reports to the quartermaster, and the quartermaster kind of looks at him and he goes, you're looking a little fat. We might need to bring you in. And Joseph Plum Martin goes, no, I'm really good at my job. Let me do it. So he talks to the quartermaster into letting him back out. But he writes it in such a way, along with, not just those funny stories, but also the sarcasm that he gives with the Thanksgiving for Congress. We're going to get this great meal, and it's going to be amazing. And then we get this.
It's rice and vinegar.
It's rice and vinegar, yeah. So he is able to weave humor in, which is such a human thing for us to do throughout our lives.
And then there's also the seriousness and the gravity of the situations that he found himself in. Specifically, I'm thinking of the autumn of 1777, so just before the Valley Forge winter encampment. At Fort Mifflin, one of the most underappreciated actions of the war, battles of the war, and Joseph Plum Martin was there for it. And at the siege of Fort Mifflin, Joseph Plum Martin loses one of his friends from the army, and Joseph Plum Martin's a teenager at this point in time. So just think about as modern teenagers might be viewing this. They're dealing with serious situations at school or at home, and Joseph Plum Martin is dealing with a serious situation of losing his friend. One moment he's there, one moment he's gone, and the seriousness of that shows that there's a lot of connections that we can make. There are hard times, there are good times, but you can persevere and get through those times by remembering the friend you lost, or commemorating their life, or moving on and living your life in a better way and improving yourself, because life is precious, and Joseph Plumb Martin saw that firsthand when he lost his friend at Fort Mifflin.
So we're here inside the Museum of the American Revolution, and the last thing I wanted to talk about was why this story is important now. We're recording this in 2020. What about Martin's story, and particularly the play version of Martin's story? Because you could read the book, but we've seen it as a live theater piece. Why do you think that story is important today? What speaks to you in the moment?
So coming to the museum with more of a theater background, and then being part of this, one of the reasons I enjoy working for the museum as a VEA, Visitor Engagement Associate, is because of the emphasis that the museum places on historical empathy, and that is where theater and the mission of the museum intersect. Theater is an empathy machine. It's one of its greatest aspects. It's one of the reasons I love doing it. So to be able to cultivate that empathy for people, for someone who actually lived, is important to me and just my personal mission in life. But I think that cultivating that empathy with this story is a very important thing that we do with the piece, and it gives people an opportunity to pull these characters out of the paintings and to put them in real life in front of them, to realize that, yeah, they might have dressed different, they might have eaten different things, they might have even said things a little differently, but they were still people who experienced joy and loss and love and tragedy and war and revolution. So that's one of the things that I really love being able to do it for.
Meeting Joseph Plumb Martin in person in via this program in a year like 2020 and beyond is really important, because the people that think they might know a lot about the American Revolution, or they think they have the storyline right about how the United States won its independence from Great Britain, they might not have known of a person like Joseph Plumb Martin, and might have a different perspective on what that revolutionary moment was like for the young United States. They might see it from the perspective of somebody sort of at the lower level of society, the average person, or the common person. And seeing history from that point of view is really significant and really important, because history is not all about just learning about heroes and battles and victories, but it's also learning about defeats and people might not have much respect for, but we can still learn from them. And we can also learn from not only leaders, we can also learn from common people and their perspectives. And I think that's a really important aspect of Joseph Plumb Martin's story, hearing words from a common person, from someone who we can relate to in some ways, and we can't relate to in other ways, but we can learn from his experience and hear his words, hear his perspectives, and use that knowledge to go forward and think about. Joseph Plumb Martin was in difficult situations. I often find myself in difficult situations. How can I overcome them, just like somebody like he did?
Yeah, I think in 2020 we assume we live in a world that has never been more complicated, more difficult, more global. And Joseph Plumb Martin is someone who went through a global revolution, right, where everyday people changed the world. And I think what I love about this theater piece is that I can, by benefit of years of practice, like I can look at a book and I can feel, the things that people are writing. But a lot of people come to the museum, they want to see the film version, or they want to see the tableau with life-size figures, or they want to walk on the deck of a privateer ship. And a lot of people want to meet someone, right? And that can be pivotal for someone just to believe that these things ever happened in the first place, that these people were real in the first place.